Long before European ships touched the shores of the Americas, two massive continents were alive with civil propagers.
Ancient Mesopotamian people built cities larger than London, carved temples that touched the sky, mastered astronomy.
These were not empty lands.
The story of the Americas before colonization begins with diversity. More than 1,500 languages were spoken. Thousands of distinct cultural groups lived across forests, mountains, deserts, plains, and islands. From the frozen tundra of the Arctic to the rainforests of the Amazon, humanity had shaped every corner of these lands. Each society developed in its own way, guided by environment, belief, and ingenuity. Together, they formed a mosaic of cultures, unlike anything seen in Europe. In the north, vast nations controlled the forests, rivers, and plains. The Iroquois Confederacy formed a political alliance, so sophisticated that its influence would later help inspire democratic ideas in the United States. Along the Mississippi River Valley stood enormous cities, like Cahokia Metropolis, filled with pyramids of earth. Home to tens of thousands of people, traders traveled hundreds of miles, exchanging shells, copper, art, and stories. This world was alive with movement and memory. Further south, in the ancient jungles of Central America, rose the Maya civilization. They built towering pyramids aligned perfectly with the stars. Their astronomers predicted solar eclipses with astonishing accuracy. Their mathematicians invented the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. They created books of bark paper, written in a beautiful and complex script that recorded history, science, and myth. Their cities Tikul, Palenque, Copan stood as symbols of human achievement. Nearby, along the Gulf of Mexico, flourished the Olmec civilization, the mysterious mother culture of Mesoamerica. They carved colossal stone heads weighing tons, created early writing systems, and laid the foundation for mathematics, religion, and architecture that later civilizations would inherit. Their influence echoed across centuries, shaping the world to come. In the high plateaus of central Mexico rose the mighty Aztec Empire known to itself as the Mexica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a masterpiece of engineering, built on a lake with canals, floating gardens, and stone causeways that glittered beneath the sun. European visitors would later describe it as one of the greatest cities they had ever seen, larger than many European capitals. Cleaner, better organized, and filled with bustling markets that sold everything from gold to chocolate. Their society was complex, deeply spiritual, and governed by laws, education, and strict social structure. Beyond Mexico, stretching across the spine of South America, lay the Inca Empire, the largest empire the Americas had ever seen. From Colombia to Chile, they built an astonishing network of stone roads, spanning more than 20,000 miles. These roads crossed deserts, mountains, valleys, and cliffs, connecting a world held together by organization and discipline. Their engineers carved cities like Machu Picchu and Cusco into the high Andes, blending architecture with nature in ways that continue to inspire wonder. They mastered terraced farming, transforming mountainsides into fertile steppes that fed millions. But the Incas had no writing in the traditional sense. Instead, they used a system called quipu, knotted strings, that recorded information with remarkable precision. It was an empire that proved administration could thrive without written script, powered instead by memory, calculation, and a disciplined social system. To the east, deep within the vast Amazon rainforest, lived societies that Europeans would misunderstand for centuries. Many assumed the rainforest hid only small, scattered tribes. But new discoveries reveal something far different. Enormous settlements connected by roads, canals, defensive ditches, and agricultural fields. The Amazon was not untouched wilderness, it was a carefully managed garden, shaped by generations of human hands. People cultivated crops that later changed the world, including manioc, cacao, and dozens of fruits unknown to Europe. Farther north, in the deserts of the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built cities of stone and adobe. Chaco Canyon, with its massive circular complexes and astronomical alignments, became a cultural and economic center. These societies created intricate pottery, developed irrigation systems, and built roads that stretched across the harsh landscape. Their descendants, such as the Hopi and Zuni, preserved traditions that stretch back 1,000 years. Each part of the Americas carried its own story, its own brilliance. The Caribbean islands formed rich networks of trade and culture, home to the Taino and Arawak peoples, who crafted elaborate canoes, and navigated open waters with skill. The plains of North America were home to powerful nations whose lives were shaped by buffalo, ceremony, and the vast open sky. The Northwest coast produced art from totem poles to ceremonial carvings that remains unmatched in detail and meaning. Agriculture rose independently in multiple regions. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, peppers, squash, and countless other crops were domesticated by indigenous peoples. These foods would later feed the world and transform global cuisine. But in these earliest times, they shaped cultural identities and religious rituals. The earth was not just a resource, it was a sacred partner in life. Before Europeans arrived, the Americas were not frozen in time. Civilizations rose and fell. Cities grew and were abandoned. Droughts, wars, migrations, and cultural exchanges shaped the continents just as they shaped Europe, Africa, and Asia. The people of the Americas created complex societies that adapted to change, blended ideas, and invented solutions suited to their environment. The world of the Americas was one of intellectual achievement, artistic creativity, and profound spirituality. It was a world where ancestors were honored, nature was respected, and communities were bound by ties of kinship and tradition. This is the world that existed before colonization. A world thriving with innovation. A world full of stories, knowledge, and beauty. A world that would soon come face to face with an unimaginable force that would reshape everything. This was the last moment before collision. The last breath of a world soon to be changed forever. In the final years of the 15th century, two worlds existed side by side without knowing the other existed. On one side of the Atlantic stood the civilizations of the Americas, vast, complex, ancient, and diverse. On the other side stood the kingdoms of Europe, ambitious, hungry for wealth, and ready to explore beyond their known world. These two worlds moved along separate paths, shaped by different histories, beliefs, and destinies. But in 1492, the ocean that had separated them became the bridge that would bring them together. And once they met, nothing would ever be the same. Europe at this time was emerging from centuries of struggle. Wars, plagues, and political turmoil had shaken kingdoms. But new ideas were rising: curiosity, exploration, science, and a growing desire for wealth. Trade with Asia had made spices, silk, and precious goods incredibly valuable. But the overland routes were dangerous and controlled by rival empires. European powers needed a new route, a faster one, a safer one. This quest for trade became the spark that ignited global exploration. Christopher Columbus, a navigator from Genoa, believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Most experts doubted him. They knew the earth was round, but they disagreed on its size. Columbus underestimated the vastness of the ocean. Yet his confidence and persistence won support from Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, who saw opportunity, new trade routes, new wealth, new territory, and a chance to rival Portugal's growing influence. In August 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria Letters. The journey was long and uncertain. His crew faced storms, fear, and the unknown, convinced at times they would die on an endless ocean. But after more than 2 months at sea, land finally appeared. It was not Asia. It was an island in the Caribbean, home to the Taíno people, whose ancestors had lived there for generations. The moment Columbus stepped ashore marked the collision of two worlds, a collision neither side understood. The Taíno greeted the newcomers with kindness, unaware that these strangers came from a world shaped by conquest and ambition. Columbus wrote in his journal that the people were peaceful, generous, and without weapons. He immediately saw opportunity. Gold, land, labor resources he believed could enrich Spain and himself. In that moment, the seeds of colonization were planted. The first encounters were filled with curiosity and confusion. The Europeans marveled at the landscapes, the fruits, the clothing, and the unfamiliar customs. The indigenous people observed the ships, the metal armor, and the strange animals brought from across the sea. Both sides tried to make sense of the other. But beneath the surface, an imbalance of intention and expectation formed. Europeans sought wealth and expansion. Indigenous people sought peace and exchange. These differences would shape everything that followed. News of Columbus's discoveries spread quickly across Europe, sparking excitement and competition. Spain saw its chance to become a global power. Portugal feared losing influence. England, France, and the Netherlands soon realized a new era had begun, an era of exploration, conquest, and colonization. The race for the New World had started. Columbus's second voyage was nothing like the first. It was no longer an expedition, it was a colonizing mission. 17 ships and more than 1,000 men crossed the Atlantic, determined to build permanent settlements. This marked the beginning of European presence in the Americas. Villages were built, forts were raised, and quickly, conflict began. The Europeans demanded tribute in gold. The indigenous population had never mined gold on a large scale and struggled to meet the demands. Punishments were severe. Resistance grew. Misunderstandings escalated into violence. Disease, brought unknowingly by Europeans, swept through the islands. Smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated communities that had no natural immunity. Within a few decades, entire populations were reduced by staggering numbers. This was the first wave of a transformation that would reshape the Americas forever. As Spain expanded its claim, explorers pushed deeper into the Caribbean and the mainland. Other European powers followed, establishing their own ambitions: land, wealth, glory, and the promise of empire. The old world had arrived in the new one, with force and certainty, unaware of the destruction it would unleash. To the Europeans, the Americas were a discovery, a land of opportunity. To the indigenous peoples, it was the arrival of a storm never seen before. The exchange of cultures, ideas, and technologies would reshape human history. But the first contact was overwhelmingly catastrophic for those who called these lands home. Yet amid tragedy, resilience endured. Many indigenous nations resisted. They negotiated, fought, adapted, and rebuilt. They preserved their languages, their traditions, and their communities despite unimaginable loss. Their survival became one of the greatest acts of strength in human history. The events set in motion in 1492 spread far beyond the Caribbean. New empires rose. Old civilizations fell. Borders shifted. New societies were born through conflict, blending, resistance, and transformation. The first contact was not a single moment, it was the beginning of 5 centuries of change, shaping the world we live in today. 1492 was more than a date. It was the tipping point where 2 worlds collided. One would rise to dominate. The other would endure through strength and memory. The story of colonization began here, in the meeting of curiosity and ambition, generosity and force, hope and consequence. A moment that changed everything. When Columbus returned to Europe with news of new lands, Spain saw more than discovery. It saw opportunity. Wealth, territory, power. These promises ignited a fire that would drive explorers, soldiers, and fortune-seekers across the Atlantic. What began with curiosity quickly evolved into conquest. The Caribbean became the first stage of a transformation that would reshape the entire hemisphere. In the early years, Spain focused on the islands Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. These lands were full of fertile soil, rivers, and resources the Europeans desired. At first, relations with indigenous communities were hopeful. The Taino and Arawak people offered food, guidance, and knowledge of the landscape. But Spain's ambitions soon overshadowed any possibility of peaceful coexistence. Gold became the obsession. Rumors of golden rivers and mountains filled the minds of conquistadors. Spain demanded tribute from indigenous populations, forcing them to gather gold dust from riverbeds, even if none existed. Those who failed were punished brutally. The encomienda system, forced labor under Spanish settlers, spread rapidly. Indigenous people who had lived freely for generations now found themselves enslaved in their own land. Meanwhile, disease continued its silent devastation. Smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses that arrived unintentionally with Europeans, swept across communities with unimaginable speed. Entire villages disappeared within months. Chiefs, healers, elders, children, no one was spared. Populations that had thrived for centuries collapsed. The Caribbean became a tragic preview of what would soon spread across the continents. As Spain secured the islands, its ambitions expanded to the mainland. Stories traveled back to Europe. Tales of vast empires, cities made of gold, and civilizations richer than anything the Caribbean possessed. These stories reached the ears of men who believed that glory awaited them across the seamen like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. Cortés began his march into the heart of Mesoamerica in 1519. His destination was the Aztec Empire, ruled by the Emperor Moctezuma II. The Aztecs were powerful, organized, and deeply spiritual. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, stood like a jewel on a lake, connected by causeways and canals, a city of temples, markets, and brilliant engineering. Yet despite their strength, The Aztecs were not invincible. Courts arrived with something more dangerous than weapons: strategy. He formed alliances with indigenous nations who resented Aztec dominance. Every step he took inland added new allies to his ranks. When he reached Tenochtitlan, he entered as a guest. Moctezuma welcomed him with respect, unsure if Cortes was a divine figure or a threat. But misunderstanding, fear, and ambition destroyed any chance of peace. Tensions erupted into violence. Spanish forces captured Moctezuma. Chaos spread. The Aztecs pushed the invaders out during the dramatic Night of Sorrows. But disease struck once again. Smallpox killed thousands, including leaders and warriors. When the Spanish returned with reinforcements, they launched a brutal siege. Tenochtitlan fell in 1521, marking one of the most dramatic collapses in world history. A thriving empire was reduced to rubble in less than 2 years. While Mexico fell under Spanish control, another empire awaited its fate far to the south. Pizarro, inspired by Cortes' success, set his sights on the Inca Empire. The Incas were recovering from a devastating civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Exhausted and divided, they were vulnerable. When Pizarro met Atahualpa in Cajamarca, he carried out a ruthless strategy. He invited the emperor to meet peacefully, then sprung an ambush. Atahualpa was captured. A ransom of gold and silver was demanded, one of the largest payments ever recorded in history. The Incas filled rooms with treasure, believing their emperor would be freed. But once the Spaniards had what they wanted, Atahualpa was executed. Chaos followed. Spanish forces marched through the Andes, seizing cities, claiming territory, and dismantling the empire piece by piece. By 1533, the Inca state had collapsed, leaving the largest empire in the Americas under Spanish control. Across the continents, Spain expanded its influence. Soldiers, missionaries, settlers, and administrators arrived in waves. New Spain rose in Mexico. Peru became another center of power. Mines produced mountains of silver that fueled the Spanish economy and transformed global trade. Spanish succeeded in building one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But conquest was not just a story of violence. It was also a story of cultural collision, resistance, and survival. Forced labor systems like encomienda, and later repartimento, pushed indigenous populations to the brink. Christian missionaries attempted to erase traditional religions, while indigenous people blended old beliefs with new ones to protect their identity. Spanish cities rose on top of indigenous ruins, yet indigenous knowledge continued to shape agriculture, architecture, and medicine. Meanwhile, Spain faced its own challenges. Conquistadors often fought each other for power and wealth. Rebellions erupted, some lasted decades. In many regions, indigenous nations adapted, resisted, or retreated into mountains, forests, and jungles where Spanish control was weaker. The Caribbean, once the starting point, had been transformed into a hub of plantations. With native populations decimated, Spain and soon other European empires turned to Africa for labor. The transatlantic slave trade expanded, bringing millions of enslaved Africans to the New World. This marked the beginning of a tragic chapter that intertwined the fate of 3 continents. By the mid-1500s, Spain had become the dominant force in the Americas. Its empire spanned from California to Chile, from Florida to the Caribbean. Its wealth flowed across the Atlantic, shaping European politics, fueling wars, and altering the global balance of power. But beneath this empire lay the stories of nations destroyed, cultures transformed, and people who endured both unimaginable suffering and extraordinary resilience. Spain's march through the Caribbean and the mainland was not simply a conquest. It was the beginning of a new world, one forged through conflict, survival, and the collision of civilizations. The Americas had entered a new era, and the echoes of this transformation would be felt for centuries. In the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire stood as one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a vision: grand temples, floating gardens, markets full of life, and a population larger than many European cities. The empire stretched across central Mexico, commanding tribute, trade, and loyalty from countless city-states. It was a world of immense complexity, ruled by an emperor who carried both political and sacred authority. Yet within a few short years, this empire, built over centuries, would collapse under the force of a handful of foreign invaders. The story of its fall is not simple. It is not merely a tale of Spanish steel and gunpowder. It is a story of alliances, fear, misunderstanding, ambition, and a tragic chain of events that shaped the future of the Americas forever. Everything began in 1519, when Hernan Cortes landed on the eastern shores of Mexico. He arrived with only a few hundred soldiers, some horses, steel weapons, and a fierce determination to carve out wealth and glory. But what gave Cortes his true advantage was not his army, it was his ability to exploit divisions within the Aztec world. The Aztec Empire was powerful, but it was not loved by all. Many surrounding regions resented the heavy tribute demanded by Tenochtitlan. Some had been conquered in brutal wars. Others feared sacrifice or political control. Cortes recognized this resentment almost immediately. Instead of facing the Aztecs alone, he sought allies among their enemies. His first major alliance came with the Totonacs, who welcomed anyone willing to oppose Aztec dominance. Later, he encountered the Tlaxcalans' fierce warriors, who had resisted Aztec expansion for generations. At first, the Tlaxcalans fought the Spanish with determination, but after battles that shocked both sides, they saw an opportunity. By joining forces with the newcomers, they could finally break free of Aztec pressure. This alliance proved decisive, giving Cortes thousands of indigenous warriors, guides, translators, and strategists. One of the most influential figures in this story was a woman known as Malintzin, or La Malinche, enslaved, gifted to the Spaniards, and used as a translator. She became Cortes' key advisor. She spoke both Nahuatl and Maya, allowing communication between the Spanish and many indigenous groups. Through her, alliances were forged, negotiations held, and crucial intelligence gathered. Over time, she became one of the most debated figures in history, seen by some as a traitor, by others as a survivor, shaped by impossible circumstances. As Cortes marched toward Tenochtitlan, he sent messages to the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II. The emperor watched these events with a mix of caution, religious fear, and uncertainty. Aztec prophecies spoke of the return of a god from across the sea. Cortes' pale skin, metal armor, and strange animals created doubt in Moctezuma's mind. Unsure whether the Spaniards were enemies or divine messengers, he chose a path of diplomacy. In November 1519, Cortes entered Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards were stunned. The city was unlike anything they had imagined: massive temples, markets overflowing with goods, aqueducts, gardens, and a level of organization that rivaled Europe's greatest capitals. Moctezuma greeted Cortes with ceremony, gifts, and hospitality, but behind the courtesy lay deep tension. The Spanish, seeing the city's wealth, believed they had found the prize they sought. The Aztecs, watching the foreigners closely, realized they faced a threat unlike any before. Within days, the fragile peace shattered. Fearing rebellion, Cortes seized Moctezuma and held him hostage inside his own palace. The emperor, once revered as a semi-divine ruler, now stood powerless under foreign control. The city simmered with anger. The breaking point came when Cortes temporarily left the capital to confront Spanish forces sent to arrest him. In his absence, the remaining Spaniards slaughtered unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The massacre ignited the city. When Cortes returned, he found Tenochtitlan in open revolt. The Spaniards were trapped. Moctezuma tried to calm his people, but they no longer saw him as their leader. Stones were thrown. Insults were hurled. Some accounts say the Aztecs killed him. Others say he died from Spanish wounds. His death symbolized the collapse of Aztec unity. The Spaniards fled the city in a desperate nighttime escape, later called the Night of Sorrows. Hundreds drowned or were killed as they attempted to cross the causeways, burdened by stolen gold. But Cortes survived and he returned stronger. What changed everything was disease. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by a member of the invasion, swept through the valley like a storm. Entire families died. Warriors and priests succumbed. The new Aztec emperor perished. The epidemic crippled the empire at the worst possible moment. In Ye War Re, Cortes launched a full assault on Tenochtitlan. His forces included thousands of indigenous allies, seeking liberation or revenge, along with Spanish soldiers and naval brigantines built to control the lake. The siege lasted months. Starvation, disease, and constant attacks weakened the defenders. Buildings burned, bridges fell, and once beautiful canals filled with debris. The final battles were brutal. Street by street, house by house, the city collapsed under relentless assault. On August 13, 1521, the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured. With him, the empire fell. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. A civilization that had flourished for centuries was shattered. Yet the story did not end there. Survivors rebuilt, preserved traditions, and blended their culture with new influences. Through language, art, religion, and memory, the Aztec legacy endured. But the fall of the Aztec Empire marked a turning point in world history. It opened the door for Spain's vast colonial rule in the Americas. It reshaped culture, economy, and identity across continents. It became a symbol of what happens when worlds collide, when alliances shift, when fear and ambition mix, when disease strikes, and when decisions made in moments of uncertainty shape the destiny of millions. The conquest of the Aztecs was not simply the victory of one group over another. It was the beginning of a transformation that changed the Americas forever. High in the rugged spine of the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire stretched across a territory that dwarfed any European state of its time. From the lush forests of Ecuador to the deserts of Chile, from the Pacific coastline to the towering peaks of Peru and Bolivia, the empire connected millions through an intricate network of roads, bridges, storehouses, and administrative centers. It was a masterpiece of engineering, organization, and unity. Yet even the greatest empires can be undone not by armies alone, but by timing, turmoil, and the unpredictable twists of history. And when the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they found an empire weakened from within, standing on the edge of collapse. Before Francisco Pizarro ever set foot in Inca lands, disaster had already struck. A devastating epidemic, likely smallpox, brought by earlier European contact in Central America, swept through the empire, killing thousands, including the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir. This sudden leadership vacuum triggered a violent civil war between his two sons, Huasca ruling from Cusco and Atahualpa, commanding powerful forces in the north. For years, their armies battled across mountains and valleys, burning fields, destroying villages, and exhausting the empire's strength. When Atahualpa finally defeated Huascar and claimed the throne, the empire was fractured, demoralized, and vulnerable. This was the moment Pizarro arrived in, outsider stepping into a nation already divided. Francisco Pizarro had come with a small band of soldiers, fewer than 200 men, but with ambition far greater than their number. Like courts before him, Pizarro sought wealth, power, and glory. He had heard rumors of an empire filled with gold and riches beyond imagination. What he found was even more tempting: a kingdom torn apart and ripe for manipulation. Atahualpa, unaware of the full danger the Spaniards posed, agreed to meet Pizarro in the town of Cajamarca. Confident after his victory in the Civil War, he arrived with thousands of unarmed followers, believing that a peaceful show of strength would be enough. He saw the Spanish as curious outsiders, not as a threat capable of bringing down an empire. Pizarro saw something very different. He saw an opportunity to strike at the heart of the Inca leadership. He devised a plan of stunning audacity to capture the emperor himself. When Atahualpa entered the square, Pizarro's men sprang the trap. Cannons fired, horses charged, and steel weapons cut through unarmed attendants. Chaos erupted. The Incas had never seen horses before, never faced gunpowder weapons, and never encountered men who fought with such ruthless precision. Amid the confusion, Pizarro seized Atahualpa, dragging him to safety while his forces continued the slaughter. It was one of the most shocking moments in the history of the Americas. The capture of a ruling emperor by fewer than 200 foreign invaders. Atahualpa understood immediately the gravity of his situation. Without their emperor, the Inca armies were directionless, unable to coordinate or respond. Hoping to secure his release, Atahualpa promised the Spaniards something unimaginable: a ransom so vast it would stun the world. He offered to fill a room with gold, and twice fill the same room with silver. The Incas complied, gathering treasure from across the empire. Temples were stripped, artifacts were melted. The ransom grew until it filled the chamber nearly to the ceiling. But the Spanish had no intention of freeing him. Fearful that an army might rise to rescue the emperor, and eager to eliminate any threat to their power, they held a trial one based on false charges and condemned Atahualpa to death. In 1533, he was executed. For the Inca people, the loss was catastrophic. Their emperor was more than a ruler. He was a sacred link between the people and their gods. His death shattered the spiritual authority of the empire. With Atahualpa gone, Pizarro marched toward Cusco, the heart of the empire. Along the way, he used familiar strategies, forming alliances with rival factions, exploiting divisions, and using indigenous enemies of Atahualpa to strengthen his army. Many saw the Spaniards as a lesser evil compared to the Civil War, unaware of the devastating future that lay ahead. When the Spanish entered Cusco, The city fell with shocking ease. The empire's administrative core collapsed. Pizarro placed a puppet emperor on the throne, a young prince named Manco Inca, hoping to legitimize Spanish rule. But Manco Inca soon realized he was a prisoner, not a ruler. In 1536, he escaped Cusco and launched a massive rebellion, surrounding the city with tens of thousands of warriors. For months, Cusco burned. The Spanish fought desperately, barely holding on. It was one of the greatest indigenous uprisings in colonial history. But Spanish reinforcements eventually broke the siege. Manco Inca retreated into the remote fortress city of Vilcabamba, where the last remnants of the Inca state survived for decades. Even after the empire fell, resistance never died. Guerrilla warfare, revolts, and secret rebellions shook Spanish rule for generations. But disease, forced labor, and the relentless spread of colonial systems slowly tore apart the fabric of Inca society. One of the most devastating aspects of Spanish rule was the meta sistema forced labor policy that sent thousands of indigenous people to work in silver mines under brutal conditions. The mine at Potosi became one of the richest sources of silver in global history, enriching Spain while costing countless lives. The wealth extracted from Inca lands fueled European wars, built palaces, and transformed global trade. But for the indigenous people, it brought suffering, exploitation, and collapse. Despite this destruction, the Inca legacy lived on. Their knowledge of agriculture, engineering, and medicine endured. Quechua, the language of the empire, remains spoken by millions today. Traditions, festivals, and beliefs survived by blending with new influences. The strength of the Inca spirit proved more enduring than the empire itself. The fall of the Inca Empire was not inevitable. It was the result of a perfect storm: disease, civil war, internal fractures, and the arrival of a small but highly strategic foreign force. It was a collision of worlds that changed history forever. Pizarro did not defeat the Inca with numbers. He defeated them with timing, manipulation, and a strategy that exploited a moment of vulnerability. But the price of that victory was immense. It reshaped the Andes, destroyed an ancient civilization, and set the stage for centuries of colonization. Empires rise and fall across history, but few have fallen as dramatically or as tragically as the Inca. Their collapse marked another turning point in the story of the Americas. The age of Spanish domination had begun, and the world that existed before would never return. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they encountered civilizations that were brilliant, sophisticated, and deeply rooted in the land. The Aztec capital rivaled the great cities of Europe. The Inca roads stretched farther than the Roman network. The Maya charted the stars with a precision unmatched in their time. Yet within a few decades of contact, entire empires fell. Millions died. The balance of power swung dramatically. Why? The answer is not simple, nor is it a story of European superiority. Instead, it is a story built on geography, biology, and technological change. A story of how continents developed differently over thousands of years. A story of advantages that Europe carried unknowingly into the New World. These advantages, guns, germs, and steelwood, determined the fate of the Americas. The first great advantage was disease. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, Europe, Asia, and Africa had spent centuries living in dense cities, surrounded by domesticated animals: cows, horses, pigs, chickens, goats, and sheep. These animals carried diseases that jumped into human populations: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and plague. Over generations, Europeans developed partial immunity. They survived outbreaks, and their bodies adapted. The people of the Americas, however, had no such history. They had domesticated only a few animals: llamas, alpacas, dogs, and turkeys. Without large herds, they were never exposed to the same diseases. For thousands of years, deadly epidemics did not shape their lives. Their civilizations grew without the biological scars that marked Europe. But when Europeans arrived, they carried invisible armies, viruses, and bacteria that devastated indigenous populations with terrifying speed. Smallpox, in particular, spread across the continents faster than the conquistadors themselves. It killed leaders, warriors, farmers, and healers. It destabilized governments and shattered resistances. In some regions, up to 90% of the population died within a century. Whole cities emptied. Traditions broke. The social fabric that held entire nations together unraveled. This biological catastrophe became one of the greatest tragedies in human history and one of the greatest unintended advantages for European conquest. The second advantage was technology, particularly weapons. European steel swords and armor were the result of thousands of years of metallurgy. In the Americas, metalwork existed but was mainly used for decoration, ceremony, and art. Weapons were made from obsidian, wood, and stone, beautiful, razor-sharp, but fragile against steel. When indigenous warriors fought Europeans, they demonstrated skill, courage, and tactical intelligence. But steel swords cut through obsidian blades, metal armor deflected arrows, and horses, animals, unknown in the Americas, for millennia dead, a new dimension to battle. Mounted soldiers moved faster, struck harder, and created fear through sheer unfamiliarity. In many indigenous languages, new words had to be invented to describe these strange, towering creatures. European guns played a role, but not the overwhelming one people often imagine. Early muskets were slow, inaccurate, and unreliable. Yet their thunderous noise and flashes of fire had a psychological impact. In battles across Mexico and the Andes, indigenous forces often faced not just weapons, but sounds and sights they had never encountered. The combination of horses, steel, and gunpowder created confusion during crucial moments of conflict. But technology alone cannot explain European success. The third advantage was strategy shaped by Europe's long history of wars, diplomacy, and political rivalry. European rulers constantly fought for territory and resources. Armies were trained. Tactics evolved. And when Europeans met unfamiliar civilizations, they brought centuries of strategic thinking. Cortes did not defeat the Aztec Empire with Spanish soldiers alone. He built alliances with indigenous groups who resented Aztec rule. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors fought alongside him. Pizarro used similar tactics against the Inca, exploiting civil war and division. European conquest succeeded not because they were stronger, but because they understood how to turn local rivalries into powerful weapons. Geography also played its part. Europe was connected to Asia and Africa through land routes and sea trade. Ideas, inventions, and technologies traveled between continents. Writing systems, metal tools, horses, gunpowder, and navigation techniques. But the Americas were separated by oceans, limiting the spread of innovations. Civilizations developed at different rhythms, shaped by isolation and local environments. The final advantage was mindset. Europe was entering the age of exploration, a period defined by ambition, hunger for wealth, and religious mission. Monarchs sought gold, glory, and the spread of Christianity. Conquistadors arrived believing they were destined to conquer, convert, and claim. This belief, combined with technology and disease, created an unstoppable force. Yet, despite these advantages, the people of the Americas did not simply vanish into history. They resisted fiercely. They adapted. They rebuilt. Indigenous knowledge shaped modern agriculture, medicine, and environment. Their descendants carried the memory of worlds that were once vibrant and alive. Guns, germs, and steel explain the mechanics of conquest, but they do not erase the brilliance of the civilizations that stood before it, nor the resilience of the people who survived. The collapse of the Americas was not a failure, was a tragedy shaped by forces beyond anyone's control. This chapter is not about superiority. It is about circumstance. It is about how the geography of continents and the biology of disease shaped the fate of millions. It is the story of how history unfolds, not only through human decisions, but through forces deeper and older than any empire. By the early 17th century, the era of Spanish conquest was beginning to slow. The Caribbean, Mexico, and South America had come under Spanish control, but the vast lands of North America remained largely untouched by European settlement. To the north, endless forests, rivers, plains, and coastlines stretched for thousands of miles. This world was home to powerful indigenous nations, each with its own culture, alliances, and territories. But across the Atlantic, new empires, France and Britain, were preparing to step into the race for land, trade, and influence. North America was not an empty continent waiting to be claimed. It was a landscape shaped by centuries of indigenous history. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Algonquian nations, the Cherokee, the Powhatan, the Huron, the Sioux, and hundreds more. These societies interacted through trade, warfare, diplomacy, and tradition. When Europeans arrived, they entered a complex web of alliances and rivalries that would shape the future of the continent. France was among the first to establish a stable foothold. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec along the St. Lawrence River, marking the beginning of New France. The French approach to colonization differed from Spain's. Instead of seeking gold and large-scale conquest, they focused on trade, especially fur. Beaver pelts were in enormous demand in Europe, and indigenous hunters became essential partners in this new economy. French traders lived among indigenous communities, learned their languages, and formed alliances that shaped the entire region. The French Empire stretched along rivers and lakes, from the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. Their settlements were small, but their influence was wide. Missionaries traveled through forests and villages, seeking to convert indigenous communities. Some were welcomed, others faced resistance. But unlike the Spanish, the French rarely attempted to dominate or destroy indigenous nations. Instead, they built relationships through negotiation, trade, and cultural exchange. Meanwhile, Britain pursued a different strategy. British settlers sought land farms, towns, and entire communities they could claim as their own. In 1607, Jamestown became the first permanent English settlement. At first, it struggled with famine, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. But tobacco transformed everything. The crop became wildly profitable, and plantations spread along the Atlantic coast. With plantations came a demand for labor, leading to the arrival of enslaved Africans in 1619, a tragic institution that would shape the future of North America for centuries. As British colonies grew, they spread from Massachusetts to the Carolinas. Puritans seeking religious freedom built tight-knit communities in New England. Merchants and shipbuilders thrived along the coast. Farmers and frontiersmen pushed deeper into indigenous lands. Unlike the French, the British aimed to populate the land with their own people, creating societies that mirrored those of England. This expansion created constant tension with indigenous nations, who faced pressure from encroaching settlers. The contrast between French and British colonization became one of the defining features of North America. The French operated through alliances and trade networks, relying heavily on indigenous cooperation. The British relied on settlement and agriculture, which required control of land and displacement of local populations. These different strategies shaped the early relationships between Europeans and indigenous nations, but both empires depended heavily on indigenous alliances. The beaver trade created powerful partnerships between the French and nations like the Huron and the Algonquin. Meanwhile, the British formed ties with the Haudenosaunee, one of the most powerful confederacies in the region. These alliances were not one-sided. Indigenous nations used European rivalries to strengthen their own political positions, playing empires against each other to protect their land and autonomy. This era also marked the beginning of major conflicts shaped by European competition. The Beaver Wars erupted in the mid-1600s, as indigenous nations fought for control of the fur trade. French, British, and Dutch traders fueled these conflicts by offering weapons and goods to their allies. The wars reshaped political boundaries, devastated some communities, and strengthened others. They were not simply European wars fought on American soil, they were indigenous wars influenced by global economic forces. As the 18th century approached, both Britain and France expanded their territorial claims. France controlled huge swaths of land, but had a small population. Britain had a booming settler population, but limited control beyond the coast. Tension grew as both empires sought to dominate the interior of the continent, especially the Ohio River Valley, a region rich in resources and vital for expansion. Indigenous nations remained central to this struggle. They negotiated, resisted, adapted, and fought to maintain sovereignty. Leaders like Pontiac, the Mohawk chief Hendrick, and other warriors and diplomats shaped alliances that could determine the outcome of empires. By the mid-1700s, the competition between France and Britain exploded into open conflict. Their race for control of North America sparked the French and Indian War, known globally as the 7 Years' War. It was a war fought not just by Europeans, but by indigenous nations who took sides or chose to defend their lands against both powers. This conflict would determine who would rule North America. It was the climax of the Age of Settlement, and the moment that forever changed the history of the continent. The French played their last card, to hold New France. The British pushed for total domination of the continent. And indigenous nations fought not for empire, but for survival. The stage was set for the next chapter in the colonization of the Americas, a chapter of war, shifting alliances, emerging nations, and a new power rising across the Atlantic, long before industrial engines powered cities, and long before global markets connected continents. A different system of trade reshaped the Atlantic world, built not on goods, but on human lives. For more than 300 years, the transatlantic slave trade transported over 12 million African men, women, and children across the ocean, turning people into commodities and transforming the Americas forever. It was one of the largest forced migrations in human history, and its impact still echoes today. The roots of this tragedy began in Europe's hunger for labor. As colonies expanded in the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, European settlers demanded workers to cultivate sugarcane, tobacco, coffee, rice, and later cotton crops that required intense labor under brutal conditions. Indigenous populations, devastated by disease and warfare, could not meet this demand. European powers turned to West and Central Africa, where existing trade networks and political tensions made kidnapping and enslavement easier to exploit. European ships arrived along Africa's coast loaded with weapons, cloth, alcohol, and manufactured goods. Local leaders, merchants, and warlords, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, participated in capturing and selling people from rival communities. Raids, wars, and kidnappings increased as the demand for captives grew. Entire villages vanished. Families were torn apart. The continent's demographic and political landscape changed as millions were taken away. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, became a symbol of human suffering. Captives were chained in dark, cramped holds below deck, packed tightly with barely any room to move. Heat and suffocation overwhelmed them. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, smallpox, fevers. Many died before ever seeing land again. Those who resisted or chose death over captivity were thrown into the sea. The ocean floor became a graveyard for countless souls whose names history never recorded. Reaching the Americas did not bring relief, marked the beginning of a lifetime of forced labor. In the Caribbean and Brazil, enslaved Africans worked on vast sugar plantations, often in extreme heat and dangerous conditions. Sugar was called white gold because it generated immense wealth for European empires, but it cost countless African lives. Mortality rates were devastatingly high. Planters often saw enslaved workers as disposable and replaced them with new captives, instead of allowing families to grow. In North America, slavery took different forms. On tobacco plantations in Virginia, rice fields in South Carolina, and later cotton plantations across the Deep South. Enslaved Africans built the foundations of economic prosperity that shaped early American society. Farms grew into massive estates. Cotton powered the Industrial Revolution. Banks, shipping companies, and factories profited from human bondage. Slavery became deeply embedded in the economy, politics, and culture of the emerging United States. But the enslaved were not passive victims. Resistance took many forms: escape attempts, sabotaged tools, slowed work, revolts, cultural preservation, and spiritual resilience. In the Caribbean, rebellions were frequent and fierce. In Brazil, communities of escaped slaves, quilombos, formed independent settlements. In the United States, the Underground Railroad guided many to freedom, helped by courageous abolitionists, both black and white. Despite the brutality, African cultures survived. Music, language, religion, and food blended with local traditions to create new identities: Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian, African-American. Drums carried memories of homelands. Spirituals encoded messages of hope and resistance. Stories passed through generations preserved the strength of ancestors who endured the unimaginable. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, voices against the slave trade grew louder. Former slaves like Olaudah Equiano exposed the horrors of the Middle Passage. Britain abolished the transatlantic trade in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808. But slavery itself continued. It took revolutions, wars, and generations of activism to end it. Haiti, born from a successful slave revolt, became the first black republic in 1804. Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, becoming the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to do so. When the transatlantic slave trade finally ended, its legacy remained deeply rooted in society. Families were scattered across continents. Inequality shaped generations. Racial hierarchies, built during slavery, persisted long after abolition. And yet, the descendants of those who survived built new cultures, new nations, and new movements that continue to shape the modern world. The transatlantic slave trade was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but it is also a story of endurance. Millions were taken from their homelands, but they carried their identity across the ocean. They rebuilt communities in foreign lands. They resisted oppression. They transformed the Americas in ways far more profound than the empires that enslaved them. History often records the powerful, but the true story of the Americas cannot be understood without the voices of those who endured the Middle Passage, who labored in the fields, who sang in defiance, and who survived against all odds. Their legacy is written not in monuments, but in lives, the languages spoken today, the music that shapes cultures, the movements that fight for justice, and the communities that continue to rise. The transatlantic slave trade changed the world, but it also revealed the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of culture, and the power of resistance in the face of unimaginable suffering. Across the Americas, colonization brought conquest, disease, forced labor, and slavery. But it did not bring silence. From the forests of the Caribbean to the mountains of the Andes, from African-descended plantations to the plains of North America, one force remained constant and unbroken: resistance. The spirit of the people, indigenous and African, never died. In the earliest years of colonization, resistance grew from shock and desperation. Communities that had thrived for centuries suddenly faced new enemies, new weapons, and new sicknesses. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming loss, they fought. The Taíno of the Caribbean rose against Spanish rule in the 1500s, led by figures like Hatui, who warned his people of the danger arriving from across the sea. Though defeated, he became a symbol of courage, a reminder that the first resistance was born the moment colonization began. Across the vast lands of North America, indigenous nations resisted through warfare, diplomacy, and strategy. The Powhatan Confederacy pushed back against English expansion. The Wampanoag, under Metacom known as King Philip, launched one of the most powerful uprisings of the 1600s. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy balanced alliances with European powers while defending their autonomy. Resistance was not only battle, it was negotiation, adaptation, and survival. In the Andes, the Inca spirit lived on long after the empire fell. Leaders like Manco, Inca, Tupac Amaru, and later Tupac Amaru, to lead rebellions that shook Spanish rule. They fought from mountain fortresses, united indigenous villages, and inspired future generations. Their movements spread hope across South America, the belief that their world could be reclaimed. But resistance was not only indigenous. Millions of Africans, torn from their homelands and forced into slavery, also fought for freedom. On plantations, they broke tools, slowed work, escaped into forests, and maintained forbidden traditions. Their greatest weapon was unity songs, stories, and spiritual beliefs that kept their identity alive. In Brazil, escaped slaves formed quilombos, independent communities, hidden deep in jungles and mountains. The largest Palmares survived for nearly a century and became a powerful African-led state, resisting Portuguese forces. In the Caribbean, rebellions erupted again and again, from Jamaica to Barbados, shaking colonial economies. And then came Haiti, the most extraordinary revolt in the history of the Americas. In 1791, enslaved Africans rose up against French rule in Saint-Domingue, led by leaders like Dutty Boukman, Toussaint Louverture, and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. They fought the French, the Spanish, and the British and won. Haiti became the first black republic in the world, and the only nation born from a successful slave revolt. Its victory sent shockwaves through every empire, proving that even the most oppressed could reshape history. Resistance also lived in quieter places, in languages preserved, in ceremonies continued in secret, in children taught the stories of their ancestors. Colonizers tried to erase cultures, but culture survived. People carried their identity through songs, food, rituals, art, and memory. Resistance took many forms: warfare, rebellion, escape, diplomacy, endurance, and preservation. Some revolts failed, others succeeded, but all shared one message: colonization could dominate bodies, but not spirits. Even today, the descendants of those who resisted continue their fight, not with weapons, but with movements for rights, recognition, land, and justice. Their ancestors' courage lives in their struggle. The story of the Americas is not only a story of conquest, it is a story of people who refuse to surrender. A story of the spirit that never died. By the 18th century, the Americas had become a battleground, not only between indigenous nations and European empires, but between the empires themselves. France, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands fought for land, trade, and dominance. These wars reshaped the continent and planted the first seeds of the nations we know today. Across North America, the rivalry between France and Britain exploded into a global conflict. The French and Indian War, part of the larger 7 Years' War, became a fight for control of the continent's rivers, fur trade, and strategic territories. Indigenous nations played crucial roles. choosing alliances not out of loyalty to European powers, but to protect their own lands and futures. The war raged through forests, forts, and frontiers. When it ended in 1763, Britain emerged victorious, taking vast territories from France. But victory came at a cost, and that cost would help ignite the American Revolution. As Britain tried to control its new empire and raise revenue through taxes, the 13 colonies grew restless. Protests turned to rebellion. Rebellion turned to war. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence announced a new nation, the United States of America. The revolution reshaped global politics, proving that a colony could break free from a European empire. It inspired movements around the world, from France to Latin America. In the South, Spain faced resistance across its territories. Indigenous uprisings, slave revolts, and challenges from rival empires weakened Spanish control. Meanwhile, new ideas, liberty, equality, sovereignty spread like wildfire. Across the Atlantic world, people began to question the right of kings, empires, and distant governments to rule over them. The turning point came in the early 19th century, inspired by the American and French revolutions, and fueled by local grievances. Independence movements swept across Latin America. Leaders like Simon Bolivar, José de San Martín, Miguel Hidalgo, and Bernardo O'Higgins led armies across mountains and jungles. They defeated Spanish forces, liberated cities, and declared new republics. One by one, colonies transformed into nations: Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and many others. These wars were fierce and costly. Old societies collapsed. New identities formed. The once mighty Spanish Empire crumbled under the weight of revolutionary fire. Brazil followed its own path, breaking from Portugal to form a kingdom, later a republic without massive bloodshed. But independence did not mean freedom for all. Many indigenous nations were excluded from new governments, and lost more land as settlers expanded. Enslaved Africans in many countries remained in chains long after independence. Inequality, rooted in centuries of colonization, continued to shape societies. The new nations were born, but they carried the scars of empire. Still, this era marked a turning point. The Americas were no longer a collection of colonies ruled from across the sea. They were a mosaic of independent states, each shaped by a unique blend of indigenous heritage, African resilience, and European influence. The colonial era was ending. A new age was beginning, an age of nations, striving to define themselves, rebuild their identities, and write their own stories. The battles that created these nations were more than military victories. They were statements of existence. Declarations that the people of the Americas would no longer be subjects of empire, but authors of their own destiny. When the wars of independence ended and the old empires retreated, the Americas entered a new age. The flags of Spain, France, and Britain no longer dictated life in vast regions of the continent. But the centuries of colonization they left behind had permanently reshaped cultures, economies, identities, and landscapes. The world that emerged after empire was not a return to the old civilizations, nor was it a simple continuation of European rule. It was something new, born from blending, conflict, and survival. In every region, cultures that once stood apart now lived side by side. Indigenous traditions, mixed with European languages, African rhythms, and global influences. New identities formed: Mexican, Brazilian, Haitian, Canadian, Peruvian, American. None of these identities were purely indigenous, European, or African. They were mosaics of all three, shaped by centuries of migration, resistance, and adaptation. Languages changed as well. Spanish and Portuguese became dominant across Latin America, but beneath them survived hundreds of indigenous languages: Quechua, Nawa, Guarani, Maya tongues. These languages carried the memory of ancient civilizations and the voices of ancestors who refused to disappear. African languages and spiritual traditions blended with Christianity to form new religions, songs, and cultural expressions that continue today. Economies also transformed. Plantations remained powerful in the Caribbean and the American South. Mines continued to operate in the Andes. Ports connected the newly independent nations to global trade. But wealth often stayed in the hands of elites. While inequality rooted in colonial society persisted, land ownership, race, and class continued to shape opportunity. The legacy of colonization was not erased by independence. It was inherited. Cities grew quickly. Old colonial capitals Lima, Mexico City, Havana, Bogota expanded into bustling centers of politics, culture, and commerce. Architecture mixed indigenous designs, colonial churches, African influence, and modern styles. Meanwhile, in rural regions, indigenous communities preserved traditions passed down through generations: weaving, agriculture, medicine, ceremony, and storytelling. But the aftermath of colonization was not only blending, it was also loss. Entire civilizations had been reshaped or destroyed. Languages vanished. Sacred sites were repurposed. Forests were cleared for plantations. Societies that once ruled vast territories now fought to protect small pieces of land. The environmental impact of colonization, mining, monocrop farming changed entire ecosystems. Yet, despite the damage, the resilience of the people endured. Indigenous nations fought to reclaim land, revive culture, and protect ancestral knowledge. Afro-descendant communities preserved traditions through music, dance, spirituality, and everyday life. New nations sought to define themselves through a mix of memory and reinvention. As time passed, the legacy of colonization became a subject of reflection. Museums, universities, activists, and historians worked to uncover stories long ignored. The descendants of the conquered demanded recognition. Movements for rights, equality, and cultural revival grew stronger. Slowly, the Americas began to wrestle with their past, not to erase it, but to understand it. The true aftermath of colonization was not a single event. It was an ongoing process, still unfolding today. It lives in the food people eat, the languages they speak, the music they play, the borders that divide nations, and the cultures that shape identity. It lives in the stories families tell, and in the struggles indigenous and Afro-descendant communities continue to face. The Americas were forever changed by conquest, but they were also forever shaped by the people who survived it. The Old World did not vanish. It adapted, persisted, and strengthened itself through centuries of oppression and transformation. The legacy of colonization is not just one of destruction. It is also a legacy of endurance, memory, and rebirth. It lives in every corner of the hemisphere, reminding us that history's greatest wounds can coexist with its greatest strengths. 5 centuries have passed since European ships first appeared on the shores of the Americas. Empires have risen and fallen. Nations have been born. Borders have shifted. Cultures have blended. But the legacy of colonization remains deeply woven into the fabric of the modern world. It shapes how societies function, how people identify themselves, and how nations interact on the global stage. Across the hemisphere, the influence of indigenous, African, and European history lives side by side. Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch languages dominate government, media, and education. Yet millions still speak the languages of their ancestors: Quechua, Nahuatl, Aymara, Guarani, Cray, Navajo, Maya tongues, and countless more. Each language is a reminder that indigenous identity endures, even after centuries of colonization. Racial and cultural diversity is one of the Americas' defining characteristics today. Entire populations trace their roots to multiple continents, blending indigenous, African, Asian, and European heritage. This mixing produced new cultures, new foods, new music, and new ways of living. Samba, salsa, blues, reggae, cumbia, rock, hip-hop — these sounds were born from the collision of continents and the survival of oppressed peoples. But the positive outcomes cannot hide the unfinished consequences of colonization. Inequality continues to divide nations. Many indigenous communities still face land loss, poverty, and discrimination. Afro-descendant populations continue to fight against systems shaped during the era of slavery. Wealth, education, and political power often remain concentrated in groups that benefited most from colonial rule. History's shadow stretches long across the present. Land remains a central issue. From the Amazon to Canada's far north, indigenous nations demand recognition of ancestral territories. Environmental struggles echo the old battles between exploitation and stewardship. Powerful industries push into forests, mines, and rivers, while indigenous activists defend the natural world, just as their ancestors did centuries ago. Yet despite these challenges, the 21st century has brought a resurgence of identity. Nations across the Americas are reviving indigenous languages, protecting sacred sites, rewriting school history, and recognizing past injustices. Statues of colonizers fall, museums return, stolen artifacts, governments acknowledge forgotten crimes. People reclaim traditions once banned or suppressed. The voices of the past finally rise into the present. Global politics, too, still reflect the colonial era. The wealth extracted from the Americas shaped Europe's rise. The inequalities built during slavery influenced modern economies, and the borders drawn by colonial powers created nations that still struggle with unity and identity. But today, those nations stand on their own, forging futures that reflect their unique histories, rather than the ambitions of empires. 500 years after colonization began, the Americas are neither defined by the past nor free from it. They exist in a state of transformation, honoring ancient roots, confronting painful histories, and building new societies filled with strength and complexity. The legacy of colonization is a story of loss, but also of survival. A story of destruction, but also of rebirth. A story of how people can endure the deepest wounds and still rise. The modern Americas are living proof that history does not end, it evolves. The past remains alive, shaping identity and future, reminding the world that the journey from colonization to independence, from oppression to resilience, is still unfolding today.